She sat alone, quiet. The training room still buzzed with post-drill chatter, but her silence cut sharper than any word. She unwrapped the strip of bandage around her wrist, slow and deliberate, revealing the faint, faded line of black characters barely visible against her skin. 3 recruits noticed. And then the laughter came. "What's that?" one of them barked, voice dripping with derision. "Some cheap mall tattoo." Another chimed in, grinning like a child who thought he'd found a weakness. "Looks like something you'd get from a kitchen magician with a dirty needle." The young woman said nothing. She just pulled her sleeve down, covering the mark as though she had done it 1,000 times before. Covering, always covering. That was the moment Commander Merrick walked in. His voice was sharp, weathered, ready to command the room. "Today's training session will." But his words died mid-sentence, because his eyes had locked onto her wrist. The grizzled SEAL commander, a man forged in decades of operations most of the recruits would never even hear whispered about, straightened his spine and snapped to attention. And then he saluted her. Perfectly crisp, military precision. The entire room froze. You could hear boots shifting, breaths caught in throats, laughter turned to ash in mouths that had been too loud just seconds before. The 3 recruits stared, dumbfounded, their smirks collapsing into confusion. Why had the commander, a man who never saluted anyone in training, saluted her? What did he see in those faded characters? And who really was she? Her name was Haley Brooks. She was 29 years old, though her eyes carried years she would never say out loud. The kind of eyes that had seen too much, too early. The kind of eyes that no longer flinched at things that would haunt others. Most people thought of her as a mechanic, just a mechanic. Once she had been. Helicopter engines had been her first language. She had known the hum of rotor blades better than the rhythm of conversation, and she preferred the company of tools and checklists over crowded rooms. But life had moved her forward, first into reconnaissance, then into something far more shadowed, something the world wasn't supposed to know existed. Now here she was, part of an experimental integration program at the Naval Special Warfare Training Facility, on the wind-beaten California coast, where salt air cut through the lungs and instructors. Voices echoed over obstacle courses carved into the sand like scars. This program was supposed to create more versatile teams. Pilots, mechanics, coastal operatives, all training together, sharpening each other's edges. In reality, it created tension. Because not everyone wanted her there. Haley carried herself with quiet precision. She jotted notes in her cargo pocket notebook, equipment specs, maintenance schedules, tiny details that no one else bothered to notice. She rarely spoke unless spoken to. And in a place where bravado filled the air like smoke, silence made her a target. 3 recruits had decided she didn't belong. Kyle Martinez was their ringleader. Loud, cocky, still carrying the swagger of a college football player who had never truly been tested. Every conversation for him was a locker room victory lap. Rivers was quieter but meaner. His smirk never touched his eyes. His words cut sharper, designed to wound where they thought it would hurt most. Dempsey, he just followed. He laughed when Kyle laughed, nodded when Rivers sneered. And their favorite weapon was the ink on her wrist. That faint line of characters, small, faded, homemade looking. To them it looked cheap, meaningless, something to mock. To her it was everything. They had no idea. Chief O'Hara, the old medical officer with 30 years in the Navy, had noticed it too. But his reaction was different. His weathered eyes had lingered on her wrist more than once. Sometimes he would pause, as if remembering something. Recognition. But he never spoke of it. His silence felt heavier than their insults. The recruits didn't notice O'Hara's silence. They noticed her silence, and they mistook it for weakness. That's how it always was. At lunch one Tuesday, Kyle strutted to her table, Rivers and Dempsey flanking him. She sat alone, as always, eating while flipping through a maintenance manual. "Hey, Ink Girl," Kyle said, sliding into the seat across from her like he owned it. "What's that scribble mean anyway? Looks like something you regret in the morning." She didn't look up, didn't answer. Instead, she reached into her cargo pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of cloth, a faded unit patch. She set it carefully on the table beside her tray, as if laying down something sacred. Then she said, in a voice steady as steel, "Just trying to stay professional here." The quiet authority in her tone might have silenced another man, but Kyle wasn't built for silence. He grabbed a pen and dragged crude marks across his own hand, mimicking her tattoo. "Look, guys, I'm mysterious and edgy too." The laughter from his friends echoed across the mess hall. She didn't laugh, she didn't argue. She simply packed up her tray, folded her patch, and walked away. Her silence infuriated them more than any insult ever could. And so the harassment escalated. During PT, when they carried boats across the dunes, Kyle and Rivers would deliberately shift their grip, letting the weight fall into her side. She staggered but never complained. During weapons training, Rivers would smirk, checking his target sheets and making loud remarks about accuracy. "Must be hard to shoot straight with that ink distracting you." Her response: "Load, aim, breathe, squeeze. Center mass every time. Tight groups, no wasted rounds." Their insults bounced off her armor of silence. But the silence wasn't empty. Inside it was heavy. Heavy with memories she carried alone. The tattoo on her wrist wasn't a decoration. It was a ledger, a weight she bore when no one else could see. And though she never said it aloud, she wondered if maybe the recruits were right, if she didn't belong here anymore. Not because she wasn't capable, but because the kind of things she had already lived through didn't belong in classrooms and obstacle courses. They belonged to the shadows. Still she stayed. And when the storm came, she would be ready. But they were not yet. That night during weapons cleaning, Lieutenant Markson had stopped in front of her. His eyes flicked to her wrist. "That ink," he said, voice carefully neutral. "What's the story?" She looked up, met his gaze without hesitation. "It's how I remember to keep moving forward, sir." "That's not what I asked." She returned to her weapon, voice even. "It's all the answer I have." He studied her, then nodded once, walked away. But he was filing away questions, and she knew it. Everyone had questions. No one had the courage to ask the right ones. Not yet. And the storm, the real test, was coming. They just didn't know it would begin with her standing up in a room full of silence, when no one else dared. That night in the barracks, Haley lay awake long after lights out. The voices of the recruits replayed in her head, the laughter, the sneers, the mockery. And beneath it all, the image of Merrick's salute. Why had he done it in front of everyone? Why then? She traced the ink under her sleeve with her fingertip, as though touching the memory itself. No one here knew. No one could know. But soon they would. And when they did, the laughter would stop. Not because she silenced it, but because the truth would. Why was it always the quiet ones they targeted? That question lingered in the air during morning PT when the recruits lined up on the sand. 6 men to a boat, 6 backs straining beneath the rubber weight, 6 voices yelling in rhythm. That was how it was supposed to be. But Kyle had other plans. "Remember," he shouted, hoisting his side with exaggerated effort, "we're only as strong as our weakest link." His eyes slid toward Haley. The message was clear. They carried the boat up the dune, sand spilling into boots, lungs burning from salt air and exertion. Haley kept her pace steady, movements methodical. But twice, no, 3 times, Kyle and Rivers shifted their grip just enough for the weight to tilt her way. The boat slammed against her shoulder, forcing her to stumble. She recovered each time without a word. And still the mocking came. "Can't even handle basic boat work," Rivers muttered loud enough for instructors to hear. "How's she supposed to handle real operations?" Dempsey laughed, a hollow sound echoing more of obedience to his friends than amusement. But she didn't flinch, didn't argue, didn't bite back. Steady, silent. Inside, though, she felt it. The ache wasn't in her muscles. It was in the memories clawing their way back every time her wrist throbbed beneath the tattoo. They didn't know what those marks meant, and she wasn't about to tell them. Not yet. Weapons training came next. Rows of recruits prone on the firing line, rifles aimed at silhouettes 50 yards out. A storm brewed overhead, heavy clouds swallowing the sky, the air thick with anticipation of rain. Rivers took his shots, then sat back with smug precision. He glanced at her lane. "Bet that little doodle on your wrist helps you focus, huh? Must be hard to keep the sights steady with all that ink distracting you." Her response was measured. Load, aim, breathe, squeeze. Her rounds punched holes in the silhouette's center mass. Tight groupings, clean shots. But silence doesn't silence. It only sharpens the voices of those determined to tear you down. By the time they'd cleared their rifles, even Lieutenant Markson was watching. He approached as she wiped her weapon, his gaze steady. "That ink on your wrist," he said again, careful, measured. "You never did tell me the story." She glanced up, calm, unreadable. "It's how I remember to keep moving forward, sir." "That's not the answer I asked for." Her eyes never wavered. "It's the one I have, sir." He studied her for a beat, then nodded once and walked away. But she could feel it, the questions simmering under the surface. Soon, someone would demand answers she wasn't ready to give. The harassment escalated over the following days, not with fists or outright violence. No, their cruelty was subtler, more corrosive. At meals, they made sure no one sat with her. They called her Ink Girl, loud enough for the mess hall to hear. They dropped comments about quotas, about standards being lowered, about real SEAL material versus what they claimed she was. She answered none of it. She ate in silence. She studied in silence. She endured. But endurance has a cost. At night, when the barracks lights dimmed and snores filled the air, Haley lay awake, eyes fixed on the ceiling. The laughter of the recruits replayed in her mind. But underneath it, buried like a fault line waiting to split, she heard another voice. A voice from 2 years ago. Steady, silent. The last words of her unit leader before the explosion. 12 went in, 4 came out. The tattoo on her wrist wasn't a flourish. It was a gravestone carved into skin. Each faded line, each character, an operator who hadn't come home. They thought it was vanity. It was memory. And every time they mocked it, they mocked the dead. She breathed slow, eyes closed, pushed it all down. Because that was the only way she knew how to survive. The breaking point came during night operations training. The storm had rolled in heavy, black sky split by flashes of lightning, rain lashing the coast so hard visibility shrank to feet. Perfect conditions for failure. The recruits gathered in the briefing room, water dripping from their gear, tension thick as the storm outside. The assignment was brutal in its simplicity. Infiltrate a mock enemy position, plant a beacon, and extract undetected. 20 minutes, automated sentries sweeping the area. Failure meant remedial training, marks on their record. A mission designed to break more than it built. "We need a team leader," Instructor Barnes announced, scanning the room. "Someone to make the calls, take responsibility." Silence stretched. Kyle suddenly found the floor fascinating. Rivers checked his gear with exaggerated focus. Dempsey tilted his head back like the ceiling tiles might offer answers. No one volunteered. And then her voice. "I'll take point." It cut through the room like a blade. The laughter erupted instantly. "You," Kyle nearly shouted, eyes wide with disbelief. "You want someone with a strip mall tattoo leading us into a tactical op. This isn't arts and crafts, princess." Rivers smirked, shaking his head. "I'm sure you're great at whatever it is you actually do, but maybe leave real soldiering to soldiers." Dempsey laughed. "Yeah, this isn't community college anymore." The room buzzed with their mockery. Until the door opened. Commander Merrick entered. The air shifted instantly. Conversations died, chairs stiffened. He scanned the room, eyes sharp, weathered face carrying scars from places none of them would ever see. His gaze landed on Haley, more specifically, on her wrist, where her sleeve had slid just enough to reveal the faded characters. The room held its breath. Merrick froze. Then slowly, deliberately, he straightened to full attention and rendered a perfect salute. To her. "Ma'am," he said, voice firm enough to make the storm outside pause. The recruits froze. Kyle's mouth hung open, the insult still half-formed on his lips. Rivers looked like someone had punched him. Dempsey's confusion was total. Haley returned the salute with quiet precision. No smile, no explanation, just respect given and returned. Something passed between her and the commander in that silence, something none of them understood. Merrick finally turned to the room. His voice carried the weight of authority no one dared question. "Brooks will lead tonight's exercise. You will follow her orders as if they came from me. Questions?" There were no questions. Not a single one. The storm outside roared louder, as though nature itself approved of the silence that followed. On the equipment table, Haley moved with methodical precision. Waterproof comms checked. Emergency flares checked. Tactical lights with red filters checked. Her voice calm, controlled, treating the exercise not as training but as combat preparation. The recruits watched, still shaken by Merrick's salute. Kyle finally broke. "Look, I don't know what just happened with the commander, but—" "You don't need to know," Haley cut him off. Her tone left no room for debate. "You just need to follow orders. Can you do that?" The silence after her question was heavier than the storm. Kyle opened his mouth, closed it again, no comeback. Rivers and Dempsey looked like they wanted to sink into the floor. Haley spread the map. Rain pounded the roof, thunder shook the walls, and for the first time since they had met her, the three recruits leaned in. "The beacon goes here," she said, fingertip pressing the coordinates. "Standard approach puts us in their kill zone for 40 seconds. Unacceptable. We go under the pier structure. Use the beams for cover. Low tide gives us clearance, barely." Rivers frowned. "How do you even know that?" She didn't look up. "Because I read briefing materials, instead of making jokes about tattoos." The words landed like a slap. And just like that, the balance shifted. For the first time, they saw her not as ink girl, not as quota, not as silence, but as a leader. And the mission hadn't even begun. That night, as rain fell like knives and waves roared against the coast, 4 recruits followed Haley Brooks into the storm. And the truth about her tattoo, about who she really was, waited just beyond the darkness. How do you move when every step could mean failure? That was the question that lingered as the 4 of them pushed their boat into the violent surf. The storm tore at them, rain blinding, waves hammering against the hull like fists. The inflatable pitched and rolled, threatening to spill them before they even began. Haley sat at the bow, paddle slicing the water with steady rhythm. She didn't shout commands. She didn't need to. Her voice, low but sharp, cut through wind and rain. Steady, silent. 2 words. They anchored the team better than ropes ever could. Kyle missed a stroke, his paddle slapping the surface with an awkward splash. He cursed, squinting through the rain. "I can't see anything." "Then listen," Haley snapped, her voice barely audible over the storm but cutting to the bone. Feel the rhythm of the waves. Count the seconds between swells. Your eyes are useless, but your other senses are. Her words weren't theory. They came from somewhere deeper, somewhere lived. The boat shifted smoothly under her guidance. She adjusted their heading without looking, sensing currents the others couldn't. The pier loomed ahead, a black skeleton against a darker sky. Automated sentries swept the shoreline with harsh, white beams, slicing through rain like knives. If those lights touched them, the exercise was over. "Down," she whispered. They flattened themselves against the boat bottom as the first light passed overhead. Kyle's breathing came fast and ragged, too loud, too obvious. "Control your breathing," Haley murmured. "In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. Panic puts us all at risk." The rebuke wasn't cruel, it was firm, grounded, and somehow effective. Kyle's breath steadied. The beam passed. They lived another 30 seconds. Under the pier, the world became a maze of barnacle-crusted beams and cross supports. Visibility was gone. Every sound echoed strange. Rain hammered above, a constant roar that masked smaller noises but made orientation nearly impossible. For most, it would have been chaos. For her, it was familiar. "Beam clearance 28 centimeters, she whispered, guiding them under a low cross support. "Duck heads, keep moving." Rivers hissed as barnacles scraped his back. "How are you doing this? You can't see a thing." "Sound carries differently under structures," she replied, voice calm. "Echo tells you distance. Water movement tells you clearance. Count the intervals. Read the environment." Her words weren't instructions. They were truths, learned truths. Truths that had once meant life or death. The others tried it. Rivers closed his eyes, listening. Paddle strokes echoed sharper near supports, duller in open water. For the first time, he realized she wasn't moving blindly. She was reading a language they couldn't yet understand. And slowly, their rhythm began to match hers. They reached the beacon site with 2 minutes to spare. Haley secured the device against the coordinates with practiced precision, fingers moving like someone who had done this too many times before. "Extraction same path," she said. "Next sweep in 40 seconds, we move." They started back. But time is merciless. Kyle had wasted precious seconds earlier. Their margin was gone. As they cleared the pier, the next sentry beam swept toward them, too soon. "Light incoming," Rivers hissed, panic sharp in his voice. "Nobody move," Haley commanded. Her voice carried an authority that silenced them instantly. "Don't breathe hard, don't twitch, nothing." The beam swept across the water. 4 figures in a yellow boat, lit like an illustration in a training manual of what not to do. They braced for alarms, for the sting of failure. But nothing happened. The light passed over them, moved on. No alarms, no detection. Dempsey's eyes were wide. How did that? "Camouflage isn't about being invisible," Haley said, her voice flat. "It's about being expected. Rain creates patterns on the water. Automated systems filter out weather interference. If you don't move, you become background noise." The explanation was simple, but the truth behind it was heavier. These weren't training tricks. These were survival techniques, battlefield tested. They made it to shore with 30 seconds to spare. Dragging the boat across the wet sand, lungs heaving, the recruits stared at her with something new. Not mockery, not even respect. Something deeper. Fear. Because fear and respect were often siblings. On the beach, Kyle finally broke the silence. "Where did you learn that?" His voice was hoarse, stripped of swagger. Haley was already breaking down the equipment, movements efficient, automatic. "Same place I learned that some marks aren't decorations," she said quietly. "They're reminders of who didn't make it home." Her words struck harder than any reprimand. The recruits said nothing. For once, they understood silence. The debrief room felt small when Commander Merrick entered. The storm still howled outside, but inside, The only sounds were dripping gear and nervous breathing. The mission should have felt like a victory. Instead, the air was heavy with unasked questions. Merrick stood at the tactical display, hands clasped behind his back. His gaze swept over the team. "The unit designation on Brooks's wrist," he said, voice like gravel. "Valkyrie Reconnaissance. Forward Operating Intelligence Unit. Disbanded 2 years ago." Chief O'Hara stepped forward from the shadows, eyes lined with years of memory. "I treated the wounded from their final mission," he said quietly. 12 went in, 4 came out. Silence. The recruits shifted, the weight of those numbers pressing down on them. Kyle swallowed hard. "Classified how?" "The kind where families get folded flags and no explanations," Merrick answered. "The kind survivors carry to their graves." Rivers stared at her wrist, the faded characters no longer a joke. "That's not a tattoo." Haley's voice was steady. "It's a memorial, each character for someone who didn't make it home, coordinates marking where we lost them." The room fell into reverence. They had mocked it, mocked them. And now they realized they'd been standing in the presence of something sacred all along. Dempsey's voice cracked. We didn't know." "You didn't ask," she said. "No anger, no pity, just truth." Merrick's eyes burned into the recruits. "The techniques Brooks used tonight weren't in your manuals. They were born in combat, earned in blood." He paused, letting the words settle. "The military doesn't just teach you how to fight. It teaches you how to recognize honor when you see it, even when it doesn't look like what you expect." The lesson cut deeper than any drill. And for the first time, the recruits understood. She wasn't just another trainee. She was survival carved into flesh. Later, when the storm broke, Haley sat alone in her quarters. Gear cleaned, reports filed, silence settling over the base like a blanket. She opened her personal journal, the one that wasn't government issue. On the first page, pressed between plastic, lay the faded Valkyrie unit patch. Her wrist caught the lamplight, the memorial characters glowing faintly. This wasn't for them to understand. It was for her. A promise. A burden. A reminder. Steady, silent. The last words of her team leader. The words she carried into every storm. The words that kept her alive. How do you treat someone after you've mocked them, only to realize they've carried more weight than you'll ever know? That was the question hanging heavy in the debrief room. Commander Merrick's words still rang in their ears. Brooks's methods aren't suggestions, they're requirements. The recruits shifted uncomfortably in their seats, gear dripping water onto the polished floor. The storm still battered the coast outside, but inside, the silence was deafening. Haley sat with the same quiet posture she always had, hands folded, eyes calm, not gloating, not angry, not triumphant. Just steady. Kyle finally found his voice. "Ma'am, we owe you an apology, a serious apology." Haley didn't even blink. Apologies are just words. What matters is what you do next. She reached into her cargo pocket and pulled out 3 items, a waterproof notebook, a checklist, and a small digital recorder. One by one, she placed them on the table in front of the recruits. "Martinez," she said, voice sharp but calm, "you'll document every stealth paddling technique we used tonight. Write it up as a standard operating procedure." Kyle nodded stiffly, as if holding something fragile. "Yes, ma'am." "Rivers, you'll build a comprehensive checklist for low-visibility operations. Everything we carried, why we carried it, how it mattered." Rivers accepted the paper with steady hands. "Understood, ma'am." "Dempsey, you'll record a full after-action report. Timing sequences, coordination, all of it, so the next team learns from this one." Dempsey's head bowed slightly as he took the recorder. "Yes, ma'am." It wasn't punishment, it was responsibility, a way to transform shame into contribution. And maybe, for the first time in their lives, the three understood what leadership really looked like. Merrick's gravel voice carried the final blow. Effective immediately, Brooks is tactical advisor for all-night ops training. You'll follow her methods or you'll fail. No exceptions. No one argued. Because no one dared. The recruits filed out in silence, but Haley lingered, adjusting her sleeve, covering the faded characters once more. The memorial tattoo had been seen, interpreted, revered. And yet she still covered it. Because it wasn't for them. It was for her. Later that night, the storm began to pass. The training compound settled into its routine again, gear stored, reports written, lights flickering out one by one. In her quarters, Haley opened her leather journal. The one that had survived deployments, outlasted units, carried voices long gone. She pressed her wrist against the page, tracing the tattoo's characters with her fingertip. Each line, each mark, each name. She wrote slowly, carefully. This wasn't designed to impress. It wasn't meant for anyone else to understand. It's not vanity. It's documentation. Proof that certain people lived. Proof that certain sacrifices were made. Her pen paused. The words blurred as her mind wandered back 2 years to the Gulf. 12 went in, 4 came out. And the last thing she heard before the explosion. Steady, silent. Her hand trembled for the briefest second before she steadied it. Even now she carried that voice. Every order she gave, every correction she made, it wasn't just her. It was them speaking through her. The next morning, sunlight broke across the compound. The ocean was calmer, but the recruits' nerves were not. Kyle, Rivers, and Dempsey moved differently now. No swagger, no laughter. They carried their gear with precision, kept their voices low. The memory of Merrick's salute and Haley's quiet revelation hung over them like a weight they couldn't shake. During PT, Kyle stole glances at her, not mocking now, studying, trying to understand how someone so quiet carried that kind of presence. During weapons drills, Rivers no longer made snide remarks. Instead, he focused harder than he ever had, grouping his shots, measuring his breathing. Dempsey, always the follower, now followed differently. Not Kyle, not Rivers, but her. And Haley noticed. She noticed the way silence had shifted, from weapon to teacher. But silence is never simple. Respect is heavier than mockery. And though the recruits had begun to change, the weight of their earlier cruelty pressed on them. At lunch, Kyle finally sat across from her again. This time no smirk, no pen marks. Just him. Look, he said, words awkward. We didn't know about the tattoo, about Valkyrie, about any of it. Haley kept eating, eyes on her tray. Kyle leaned forward. I'm not asking you to forgive us, just tell me how we don't make that mistake again. Her fork stilled. Slowly she looked up. You start by asking before assuming. You start by shutting your mouth long enough to listen. You start by realizing silence doesn't mean weakness. Kyle nodded, face tight, understood. Her eyes lingered on him for a moment before she returned to her food. No smile, no softness, just truth. And somehow that was enough. But respect didn't erase her conflict. That night, alone in her quarters, she stared at the journal again, at the faded Valkyrie patch pressed inside. She had come here to train, to disappear into routine, to keep her head down. But Merrick had saluted her in front of everyone. He had dragged her ghosts back into daylight. Now, instead of blending in, she was marked. Marked by the tattoo, marked by the memory, marked by what she carried that no one else could. She closed her eyes. She had always believed her silence was strength, but maybe it was also a prison. 2 days later, Merrick pulled her aside after a drill. Brooks, he said, voice low, private, you did good with the recruits, but don't think this is just about training. They needed to see it. They needed to see you. She frowned. Sir, I didn't come here to be seen. Merrick's eyes, old and scarred, softened for a fraction of a second. None of us do, but sometimes being seen isn't about you. It's about what you represent. She looked away, out toward the ocean. The horizon stretched endless, unforgiving. What I represent is loss, Commander. What you represent, Merrick corrected, is survival. The words hit harder than she expected. Because survival wasn't glory. It was scars. It was carrying what others couldn't. It was waking up each day with ghosts at your bedside and still putting your boots on. She wanted to argue, but she didn't. Instead, she nodded. That evening, she walked the coastline alone. The wind was cool now, the sea calmer, but her mind churned like the storm hadn't ended. Every step brought back fragments of Valkyrie, faces, voices, laughter around campfires, screams in the Gulf, the sudden silence after the blast. She touched her wrist. The tattoo burned like a brand. The recruits had learned to respect it. Merrick had forced them to. But she wondered, was she ready to live with it being seen? Or would she always be the mechanic-turned-ghost, carrying marks no one was meant to read? The tide washed over her boots, and in the sound of the waves, she heard it again. Steady, silent. She whispered the words to the sea, not an order, not a command, just a memory. And somewhere in that whisper, she realized something. Silence had kept her alive. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to let her silence teach others how to survive too. How do you teach men who once mocked you to now trust you with their lives? That was the question Haley faced when the next Nitop's drill began. The storm was gone, but darkness was still unforgiving. The sea stretched flat, slick as black glass, stars smothered by heavy cloud cover. Perfect for training, perfect for failure. But this time, something was different. This time, the recruits looked at her not with smirks or suspicion, but with something closer to reverence, and maybe, under that, fear. Fear not of her, but of what she represented. Paddle rhythm, she said, voice low but firm, crouched beside the boat as they checked gear. You'll write it down later, but tonight you'll live it. Count swells, breathe with the water, listen more than you look, understand. 3 nods. No jokes. No laughter. Just nods. Kyle adjusted the waterproof notebook in his pocket. He hadn't let it out of his sight since she gave it to him. Rivers checked over the gear with uncharacteristic seriousness. He had already started building the low-visibility checklist, and he knew tonight would give him more details. Dempsey tapped the recorder in his vest. He hadn't spoken much since the debrief, but his silence wasn't mocking anymore. It was intent. And Haley. She felt the weight of eyes on her. She felt what Merrick had said pressing against her chest. They needed to see you. She didn't want to be seen, but she couldn't hide anymore. The drill began. The sea welcomed them back like an enemy, cold, relentless. Haley sat in the lead again, voice guiding them, steady, silent. The words weren't commands anymore. They were rhythm, breath, anchor. The recruits followed, awkward at first, then smoother, then steady. She watched them learn the way she had once learned, through mistakes. Kyle splashed too hard, sending ripples across the black water. Haley corrected him with a sharp whisper. Blade angle, don't fight the water, cut with it. Rivers nearly lost his rhythm during a sudden swell, panic flashing across his face. Haley didn't scold him. She just said one word. Listen. And he did. Dempsey hesitated under the pier beams, nearly freezing at the sound of echoing water. Haley leaned close enough for her voice to cut through his fear. Echo tells you distance, trust it. He pushed forward. Bit by bit they moved like a unit, not perfect, not seamless, but no longer fractured. For the first time they weren't just following her, they were learning from her. And Haley felt something she hadn't in years. Purpose. After the drill, Merrick pulled her aside. You did good, he said, arms folded, eyes studying her. You didn't just run the op, you taught them. Haley shook her head. They're still clumsy, still green. They're supposed to be, Merrick replied. What matters is they're listening now. That's you, Brooks, you turned them. She wanted to argue, to deny, to push the credit elsewhere. But deep down, she knew he was right. The recruits weren't changing because of Merrick. They were changing because of her. And the truth scared her more than the storm had. In the mess hall the next day, Kyle sat with her again. This time, Rivers and Dempsey followed. It wasn't planned, it wasn't an announcement, they just sat down. Haley kept eating, quiet as always. But the silence felt different now, not hostile, not isolating. Respectful. After a while, Kyle spoke. When you said those marks weren't decorations, I thought about it, about what I've done. I've got a tattoo on my shoulder, college thing, some motto I don't even believe in anymore. But you, he shook his head. You carry names, that's heavier than I ever imagined. Haley didn't answer, she just kept eating. But in her chest, something shifted. For the first time, she didn't feel mocked at the table. She felt seen. And that terrified her more than the mockery ever had. That night in her quarters, she opened the leather journal again. The Valkyrie patch still lay pressed inside, threads fraying. She touched it gently, tracing the edges. Her pen moved slowly. Today they followed without laughter. They listened without mockery. And for the first time, I realized my silence might not just be for me. Maybe it can keep others alive too. Maybe that's why I'm still here. She paused, pen hovering. But every time they look at me now, I feel the weight of what they don't know. They respect me, but they don't carry what I carry. They don't hear voices at night. They don't relive blasts in the dark. They don't wake up counting the names on their skin. She closed the journal. Some truths were too heavy to write twice. The next week, Merrick introduced a new exercise, multi-team night infiltration, higher stakes, more moving parts. Haley wasn't leading this one, but she was observing, advising, correcting. The recruits watched her closely, every gesture, every note she made. And when things started to fall apart, when two teams nearly collided under the pier, her voice was the one that cut through chaos. Hold, count sweeps, adjust intervals. Simple, direct, commanding. The teams recovered. Merrick caught her eye from the observation post. A rare flicker of pride crossed his face. And Haley felt it again, that weight, that paradox. She didn't want to lead, but she couldn't escape it. Because the dead had taught her things no manual ever would. And now the living needed it. One night, Rivers caught her alone in the corridor. "Ma'am," he began, awkward, I wanted to say thank you for not letting me drown back there. For," he hesitated, searching for words, "for seeing past my stupidity." Haley studied him. The smirk that had once defined him was gone. His face was open, honest. "Don't thank me," she said quietly. "Thank the ones who didn't make it home. Everything I teach, it's theirs, not mine." Rivers nodded, eyes lowering, understood. And for the first time, Haley realized she wasn't alone in carrying it anymore. Even if just a little, someone else was beginning to share the weight. But ghosts don't loosen their grip easily. That night sleep came slow, dreams came fast. She was back in the Gulf, back in the wreckage, smoke choking the sky, sand blackened by fire, the sound of rotor blades fatting into nothing. And the voice, always the voice. Steady, silent. She woke with a start, sweat on her skin, the tattoo burning under her sleeve. Alone in the dark, she whispered the names, each one, every character carved into her wrist. A ritual, a promise. And for the first time since arriving at the facility, she let herself cry. Not loud, not broken, just tears sliding down her face in the quiet. Because being strong didn't mean being unbroken. And survival didn't mean peace. The next morning, she pulled her hair into its regulation bun, straightened her uniform, covered her wrist. By the time she stepped out, the tears were gone. The silence was back. But inside, something had changed. She wasn't just enduring anymore. She was teaching. She was shaping. And maybe, just maybe, she was healing. What happens when the teacher steps back and the students must stand alone? That was the question Commander Merrick put to them on a night when the moon was a thin sliver and the sea stretched black and endless. "Tonight," Merrick announced, voice carrying over the wind, "Brooks does not lead. She observes. Martinez, Rivers, Dempsey, you lead yourselves." The recruits stiffened. Kyle's jaw tightened. Rivers swallowed. Dempsey shifted nervously. Haley stood a few paces back, arms folded, her wrist hidden beneath her sleeve. Her face betrayed nothing. But inside, she felt the weight of the test. They weren't ready, not really, not in her eyes. But survival isn't about being ready. It's about becoming ready when you don't have a choice. And tonight they had no choice. The briefing was simple. Infiltrate a mock observation post at the North Pier, plant a beacon, extract undetected. Same conditions, same risks. But this time, no Haley at the bow, no steady whisper guiding them through chaos. Only the echoes of her words. Kyle spread the map with shaky hands. "Beacon placement here, same as last op. We'll use the beams under the pier for cover. Timing's 30 seconds between sweeps. Low tide gives clearance." Rivers nodded, his voice steady. "We go silent when the beam passes. Paddle rhythm in sync with swells, no noise." Dempsey added, "I'll count sweeps, track timing." Haley listened, her face unreadable. They were repeating her words, quoting her lessons. But quoting isn't the same as living. She knew that truth better than anyone. The sea greeted them with a cold slap. The inflatable boat lurched as they launched, waves pushing hard against their progress. Kyle sat at the bow now, paddle cutting the water. His strokes were strong, but uneven. "Rhythm," Rivers whispered behind him. "Count swells." Kyle adjusted. His jaw was tight, eyes narrowed. He wasn't mocking anymore. He was working, trying. Dempsey counted under his breath. 1, 2, 3, sweep. The sentry beam swept across the shoreline. "Down," Kyle ordered. They flattened against the boat. The light passed, white glare slicing through rain. No alarms. No failure. They breathed again. From her vantage point on shore, Haley watched, arms folded. She tracked their movements, measured their timing, noted every mistake. And she felt something she hadn't expected. Pride. But pride is fragile. Under the pier, the water grew tricky. Echoes distorted, swells bounced unpredictably. Rivers nearly clipped a beam. The scrape of paddle against wood echoed sharp in the darkness. Dempsey hissed, too loud. Kyle froze, panic flickering across his face. Haley tensed on shore, her instincts screaming to intervene. But she didn't. She couldn't. This was their test. "Listen," Rivers said quickly, voice low but urgent. She said, "Echoes tell you distance. Listen." They paused. Rain hammered the surface above, but beneath it, echoes bounced off beams, faint and sharp. Kyle adjusted his angle, paddle cut smoother. They moved again. Not perfect, not seamless, but moving. At the beacon site, Kyle fumbled with the device. His hands shook. Dempsey placed a hand over his, steady, silent. The words, Haley's words, anchored him. Kyle secured the beacon. They started back. But the ocean has a way of testing arrogance. Halfway through extraction, a rogue swell slammed the boat into a beam. The crash echoed like a gunshot. The recruits froze. Haley's chest tightened on shore. The sentry beam swept closer. They had seconds. Kyle whispered, "Hide." Rivers hissed back, "We can't, we'll be seen." Dempsey's voice shook, "Then what?" "Don't move," Kyle cut him off, voice fierce. She said, "Don't move. Rain masks you, patterns hide you." They froze. The beam swept over them. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then silence. No alarms. The light moved on. They exhaled as one. And this time the silence wasn't fear. It was trust. When they reached shore, soaked and shaking, Merrick stood waiting. His scarred face betrayed no emotion. "Mission accomplished," he said, clean enough. He turned to Haley. "Well." She studied them. Kyle's chest still heaved. Rivers's hands trembled. Dempsey's eyes were wide. But they had done it. Not perfect, not flawless, but alive. She nodded once. They passed. Merrick's eyes softened for a fraction of a second. Then he barked, "Debrief in 10." The recruits stumbled past, exhausted but upright. Haley lingered, watching them go. And for the first time, she let herself believe something dangerous. Maybe survival could be taught. The debrief was short. Merrick didn't waste words. "You applied what Brooks taught you. You lived because of it, remember that." The recruits nodded. But after Merrick left, Kyle turned to Haley. "Ma'am," he said, voice rough, "I thought I understood what you meant before, but tonight I think I really got it." Haley's gaze was steady. "You didn't get it. You survived one exercise. That doesn't make you Valkyrie." Kyle's face flushed. He nodded. "Understood." She paused, then added, "But it makes you better than you were yesterday. That's the point." The words weren't soft, but they landed. And the recruits, boys who had once laughed at her tattoo, now listened like men who knew silence could save them. Later in her quarters, she opened the journal again. She wrote slowly, carefully. "They moved without me tonight. They carried the lessons. They stumbled, but they didn't fall. And I realized something. Maybe survival doesn't die with the ones we lose. Maybe it carries forward if someone is willing to teach it." Her hand lingered on the page. "But the ghosts don't let go. I taught them my lessons, but no one carries my names. No one else wakes hearing last words. No one else feels the weight carved into skin." She set the pen down, closed the book. For the first time, she didn't feel entirely alone. But the loneliness of memory was still hers to bear. The next morning during PT, Merrick's voice carried across the sand. "Brooks, Martinez, Rivers, Dempsey, front line." They sprinted, carried the boats, pushed through dunes. This time, Kyle didn't let the weight shift onto her. This time, Rivers didn't sneer. This time, Dempsey didn't laugh. They carried together, balanced, even. And Haley realized something she hadn't dared believe before. The silence that had once been a shield was becoming something else. A legacy. How do you know when training ends and reality begins? For Haley, it happened on a night when the storm returned without warning. The alarm blared across the compound, shrill and unrelenting. Boots pounded on concrete, shouts carried over the wind. The recruits scrambled from their bunks, eyes wide, adrenaline flooding their veins. Lieutenant Markson's voice cut through the chaos. "Downed aircraft. Coast Guard bird clipped the rocks 3 miles offshore. Survivors in the water. Seas are hostile." This wasn't a drill. Haley felt her stomach twist, but her face stayed calm. She pulled on her gear with mechanical precision, every strap buckled, every clip checked. Her hands never shook. Not now, not in front of them. Merrick appeared, his scarred face unreadable. "Brooks." She snapped to attention. "Your lead." Her chest tightened. "Sir." No discussion. His tone was final. "You know the water better than anyone here. You know the dark. You know survival. This isn't about rank. It's about who I'd trust when lives are in the balance. And that's you." The recruit's eyes shot toward her. Kyle, Rivers, Dempsey, the same ones who had once laughed at her tattoo now waited for her words. She exhaled once, slow. "Gear up," she ordered. "We launch in 3." The sea was a monster that night. Waves hammered the coast like fists, spray rising high enough to coat the observation towers. The rain was sideways, blinding, relentless. The recruits shoved the boat into the surf, muscles straining. Haley climbed into the bow, paddle in hand, every movement controlled. Her voice carried through the roar. Steady, silent. It wasn't a command anymore. It was a lifeline. Kyle matched her strokes, strong, rhythmic. Rivers counted swells under his breath, timing their pulls. Dempsey called intervals. The boat cut into the black water, rising and dropping with each swell. Cold spray slapped their faces, numbing fingers and seeping through gear. Ahead, faint flares marked survivors in the water, tiny sparks in a sea determined to swallow them. Haley's mind split. Part of her was here in the boat leading. But part of her was back there. The Gulf, the Valkyrie mission, the explosion, the bodies in the surf. Steady, silent. The last words of her team leader. Her grip tightened on the paddle. She wouldn't lose them, not again. Beam sweep incoming, Rivers shouted, panic sharp. Searchlights from a Coast Guard cutter sliced across the waves, disorienting. The storm turned the lights into chaos, refracting off spray. Down, Haley ordered. They flattened against the boat. The lights swept past. Kyle's breathing came fast, too fast. Control, Haley snapped. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4 now. He obeyed, breath steadied, rhythm returned. The boat survived another sweep. They reached the flare. A man clung to debris, waves battering him, strength fatting. His vest light flickered weakly. Approach from leeward, Haley commanded. Keep the bow into the swell. Don't let the current spin us. Kyle adjusted. Rivers braced. Dempsey reached out, catching the man's vest and hauling him in with raw effort. The survivor collapsed into the boat, gasping. His lips were blue, body shaking uncontrollably. Hypothermia, Haley muttered. Keep him low, cover him. They paddled on. Another flare, another survivor, this one weaker, face pale, barely conscious. Haley reached over herself, locking hands, hauling the man aboard with strength that surprised even her. Her sleeve rode up, the tattoo flashed under the rain. The recruits saw it. They didn't flinch this time. They understood. The third flare was the hardest. A woman in the water, her life vest half deflated, head dipping under with every swell. The boat pitched dangerously as they maneuvered closer. Kyle stretched too far, nearly tipping them. Stop, Haley barked, balance first. They steadied, adjusted. Then Dempsey reached with the paddle shaft, hooking under her vest, pulling her in. She coughed violently, spitting seawater, eyes wide with terror. You're safe, Haley said firmly. Stay low, breathe. The woman clung to the boat like it was the only solid thing in the world. 3 survivors. The boat was heavy now, riding low in the swells. Every stroke burned, every muscle screamed. And then the unthinkable. A massive swell surged, lifting the boat high before dropping it into a trough. Water slammed over the side, filling the floor. They baited with hands, with helmets, with desperation. Haley's voice cut through. Steady, silent, eyes forward, don't fight the sea, ride it. They obeyed. And somehow the boat didn't flip. Somehow they pushed forward. The shoreline came into view. The observation tower's floodlights cut through rain, guiding them in. As the boat scraped sand, hands rushed forward. Medics, instructors, Merrick himself. The survivors were pulled out, wrapped in blankets, rushed toward the infirmary. The recruits stumbled out, soaked, exhausted, trembling. Haley climbed out last, her movements slower, deliberate. Her wrist burned beneath her sleeve. The names, the coordinates, the ghosts. She looked at the 3 recruits. Kyle, Rivers, Dempsey. Their faces were pale, eyes wide but alive. Because they had listened, because they had learned. Because silence had saved them. Later in the debrief room, Merrick stood before them, voice like steel. This wasn't training. This was real. and you executed under conditions that would have broken seasoned operators. His eyes locked on Haley. They lived because of you. She shook her head. They lived because they listened. Merrick didn't argue, he just nodded. The recruits sat in silence, still processing. The weight of what they'd just endured pressed down harder than any training exercise ever had. Finally, Kyle spoke. His voice was raw, stripped of swagger. "Ma'am, I get it now. About the tattoo, about the silence, about all of it." Haley looked at him, calm, steady. "You don't get it," she said quietly. "Not yet. You survived once. That doesn't erase what came before, doesn't erase what still haunts." Kyle nodded slowly. But in his eyes she saw it. The beginning of understanding. That night, alone in her quarters, Haley sat with her journal. Her hand hovered over the page for a long time before she finally wrote. "Tonight the sea tried to take more lives, but it didn't. Not this time. They listened. They learned. And for the first time in years, I didn't just carry ghosts, I carried survivors." Her hand trembled. She set the pen down. For a long moment, she just stared at the tattoo, the faded black characters catching lamplight. Once mocked, now understood. And still, it wasn't enough to silence the voices. But maybe it was enough to pass them forward. How do you measure honor? By rank, by medals, by who speaks the loudest? Or by who carries the most in silence? That question lingered in every corner of the compound after the rescue. The recruits still moved stiffly, muscles sore from the storm, but their silence wasn't fatigue. It was reverence. They had mocked Haley once. Now they studied her with the uneasy respect of men who had glimpsed something sacred and knew better than to name it. Merrick gathered them in the debrief room one final time. His weathered face looked even more severe in the harsh light. He spoke slowly, his gravel voice carrying a weight that silenced every cough, every shuffle. "You were tested, and you didn't just pass. You adapted. You survived. That's the difference between training and combat, between playing soldier and being one." He paused, gaze sweeping over Kyle, Rivers, Dempsey. Then he turned to Haley. "You gave them what manuals couldn't. You gave them survival, not theory, not drills, hard-won truths." Haley sat straight, expression calm. She wanted to protest, to push the credit back onto them, but she stayed silent. Because sometimes silence says more than any speech. Merrick continued. "Effective immediately, Brooks will remain tactical advisor to this facility. Her methods are no longer optional. They are doctrine. Every recruit who trains here will carry her lessons forward." The recruits exchanged glances. Doctrine. The word landed like stone. What had once been mockery was now foundation. After the meeting, the three approached her. Kyle spoke first. His voice was different now, not booming, not brash, but steady. "Ma'am, you saved us, not just in the water, but before, with your patience, with your silence. We treated it like weakness, but it was." Rivers added, "You didn't humiliate us when you could have. You gave us responsibility, made us earn respect instead of demanding it. That's harder." Dempsey nodded, almost shy. "You showed us what matters, and it wasn't what we thought." Haley listened. Her face gave nothing away. Finally, she said quietly, "Words don't mean much. What matters is how you carry what you've learned. Tomorrow, next week, when no one's watching, that's when it counts." They nodded solemnly. No arguments, no bravado. They understood. That night the compound was still. The storm had passed, leaving the air sharp with salt and silence. Haley sat at her desk, journal open, pen in hand. Her handwriting moved carefully across the page. The recruits don't see the faces behind these marks. They don't hear the voices. They only see a symbol. And maybe that's enough. Maybe they don't need to carry the ghosts. Maybe it's my job to carry them so others don't have to. She paused, listening to the quiet hum of the night. "But tonight, for the first time in years, I felt something different. Not just loss, not just survival. I felt continuity. They will remember what I taught them. And through that, the ones we lost will live a little longer. Maybe that's all we can ask for. Her eyes lingered on the Valkyrie patch pressed inside the journal. Frayed threads, faded colors, a relic of a unit erased from records but not from memory. She touched her wrist, tracing each character. Names, coordinates, ghosts. The ink wasn't decoration. It was scripture. Outside, Merrick stood near the pier, watching the horizon. His scars caught the moonlight, his hands clasped behind his back. He had seen warriors rise and fall, arrogance burn out, silence break men. But watching Haley, he knew he was witnessing something rare. A survivor who turned her silence into strength and her scars into lessons. Days turned to weeks, training resumed. New recruits arrived, fresh voices filling the compound. They noticed the notebook in Kyle's pocket, the checklist Rivers carried, the recorder Dempsey guarded. They noticed how those three moved differently than the others, more careful, more aware. And when asked why, Kyle said simply, "Because she taught us." No explanation, no bravado. Just respect. One afternoon, during weapons drills, a new recruit noticed Haley's wrist when her sleeve rode up. "What's that?" he asked casually. Kyle, Rivers, and Dempsey froze. Haley said nothing. She pulled her sleeve down as she always did. But before the new recruit could laugh, Kyle leaned forward, his voice low and sharp. "You don't ask about that unless you're ready to hear what it really means." The recruit blinked, taken aback. He didn't push further. And in that silence, Haley felt something shift again. The lesson had carried. That night, she wrote her final entry for the week. People see marks on skin and make assumptions. They think they know the story. They don't. Some marks aren't decoration. They are documentation, proof that certain people lived, proof that certain sacrifices were made. She set the pen down. Her eyes closed. The words of her team leader echoed once more. Steady, silent. The last words she heard in the Gulf. The words she carried into every storm. And now, the words that lived in others, too. The lamp flickered as she turned it off. The journal closed. The patch pressed back into its place. Her sleeve rolled down, covering the memorial tattoo once more. Because dignity doesn't always speak. Sometimes it simply acts. And sometimes, silence is the loudest truth of all.